By the end of the 19th century, Bessbrook was up and running as a rural village with ambitious production. John Grubb Richardson was considered the patriarch of the village, providing jobs and opportunities to the people of the area. And as his retirement loomed, he began working on social programmes that would benefit the people of the village. He was succeeded in the Bessbrook Spinning Company by his son James Nicholson III, who took over the managerial arrangements of Bessbrook. James was different from his father in that he saw the pragmatic development of the village as a mutual benefit to the employer and employee. This initiated a shift from a temperate and controlled colony to a more developed and forward-thinking population. While farming in the 19th century was developed, it was with the advancement of production that the demand was continually increasing, and farmers from across the province were competing with other farmers and imports to Belfast from across the world. Our story now picks up with Edward, a flax farmer at the turn of the 20th century.
Hello there, I'm Eddie. I'm from Bessbrook. I'm a flax farmer and I've grown up outside the village, taken over from my dad's farm when he passed away. The linen trade in Bessbrook has been booming, but it's a risky business. Over the 60s and 70s, the linen trade has been a staple part of our work, but with so many farmers supplying stock, it has become very competitive. The Bessbrook Spinning Company began to diversify, making more value-added products. Got to the point there was at least 6,000 different products being sold. The dividends were being paid handsomely to the shareholders, right up until the end of the 80s. But even though there was a lot of demand at the time, when the demand dwindled, the looms would just go quiet, whereas I had to think on my feet. One particular story happened when we got a huge order of flax later in the year. But without being able to afford the upfront costs, I had to get a lot more creative on how to produce the product. Then an idea was given to me one night by my old friend Peter McGinn. We were down in Camla having a few pints when he told me how to source the fertiliser that I needed. Then I just had to run it past the boss, my wife.
You smelled worse than a brewery.
Oh, old Peter McGinn was down, you know him. He makes enough for Mr. Grant, he can afford to buy the odd pint for his pals.
Well, with the amount of dung that man talks, I'm surprised he can fit anything else into his mouth. What?
It's nothing. It's just that you look so beautiful tonight.
You must be drunk, because the only time you ever tell me that I'm beautiful is when you're with old Peter McGinn.
Maybe you only look beautiful when you're scowling at me.
Well, you should be saying that to me all the time then.
Listen, I think he came up with a plan.
Right?
I was speaking to Peter McGinn. Now hear me out. And we talked about our issue with the fertiliser. And he came up with a very interesting idea.
Edward, Peter McGinn is notorious with his talk. And it's mostly human waste. What's his plan this time?
Well, it's funny you should mention human waste.
While Edward is off preparing his plan, we can use this chance to look at James Nicholson Richardson. James was born to John Grubb Richardson and his wife Helena Grubb in 1846. James championed tenants' rights, even when it was not in his best financial interests. And he advocated to the reform of the Lands Acts, which elected him to Parliament in 1880 for County Armagh. He championed tenants' rights in a time when the upper class were uninterested in the affairs of the lower classes. He is remembered as a fair and diligent manager who took the Bessbrook enterprise through unpredictable times. The linen trade became irregular, with massive orders some years and less the next. James was able to keep the company growing, but it was the bottom end of the production chain who felt the pinch. Which brings us back to Edward. Edward was struggling to provide enough crop to the mills as it took a big investment until crops were ready. Edward found himself with too great an outlay and so took a creative approach to finding materials that would help him cut costs with fertiliser.
Life can get messy when you're working on a farm, but us folk in Bessbrook are known to get stuck in. The village began to grow on the outskirts, with Quarry Row and High Street building more houses. James Richardson was always looking out for the residents in Bessbrook, and he made sure the village was fit for purpose. 2 large squares with wide open spaces at the centres, laid out with gardens, bowling greens and tennis courts. The houses themselves had little front gardens, and there was schools and churches for all denominations.
By 1880, the village was fully formed, and the streets and squares were a beautiful recognition of the work and planning that went into the village. The Richardson family really thought about the well-being of their workers, and the company was growing. But this meant expectations were made of the company. And while John Grubb Richardson had been a stable part of the company's growth, it was his son who led the company into new territories. While industry was changing the face of the village and creating new population of workers, farming was still a stable income for many in the area, and Bessbrook became a hive of activity for farmers selling their wares.
Hello, my name's Edward. I own the farm up McShane's Road.
I can't afford anything, I'm sorry.
I'm not here to sell. I'm here
No,
to...
I'm sorry, I can't. You just have to wait till my husband comes home.
Hello. No, I'm looking to clean out your outhouse.
At the turn of the 20th century, the main village had been built, and the mill was employing nearly 3,000 people. More streets and housing were built in the outskirts of the village, and Edward began to visit each of them, in the hopes of clearing out their outhouses, to make some homemade fertiliser.
Hello. Is your mother and father here?
My parents are dead.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Do you live with your aunt or your uncle?
No, just myself.
You live here by yourself?
Seamus, who is it?
Just some farmer, Nan. He's been going round the village asking people to see their outhouse. I'll tell him to go away. Go away. Actually, Nan asks, would you be willing to clean the outhouse for a price?
I'm hoping to make some fertiliser and help some people while I do.
Well, we're definitely in need. Come on in. Oh yeah, Nan's not well.
Working conditions were great in the mill. James Richardson worked hard in securing better wages, better clothes and boots for the employees, and also allowing shorter hours for women and children. There's some characters in this village. Come to think of it, there's that young lad in his nan's house hasn't stopped following me about.
Things were really starting to progress in Bessbrook, with the village fully built and growing by the end of the 1880s. But the 1890s would prove difficult for the young village, when a massive fire ripped through the mill in 1889, damaging buildings, burning flax, tow, yarn and Damascus cards to the value of £5,000, a total loss of over £10,000. Even though the 1890s promised improvements in business, things didn't necessarily go that way, and the village was rocked when John Grubb Richardson passed away in 1890.
Things were beginning to look up for me, but going south in other places. After the fire in the mill, it took a number of years to get the structure back again, and with the death of John Grubb, the village looked a little lost for the first time in its history. The machines were beginning to get old, and demand wasn't what it used to be. Downsizing and selling off some of the mills was inevitable. This didn't bode well for the likes of me and other people in the village. Hello there. This may seem like an odd question. Do you have an overflowed outhouse that needs cleared out?
I'm sorry?
Oh, is that the toilet man? That's great. Show him where it is, love.
It's just through there.
Thanks. I knew I seen that little lad jump over the wall. What the? Oh!
The village needed to navigate through the turn of the century, and it was the foundations that the community was built on that ensured its survival into the 20th century.